All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started today. First off, my name is Kendra Rose. I am the A&R educator in Crawford County, and I'll be moderating this webinar this morning. Um, so our topic for today is trees for healthy soils. We're going to discuss agroforestry and silvopasture. For a few housekeeping things before we go ahead and get started. We will have some CCA continuing education credits today, and you'll receive that information at the end of the program, so please stick around. The session will also be recorded and will be available on the AgCrops website. Um, you can see the link, you can see the link here. If you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. You can also email any questions to Asmita. Her email is here on the screen as well. And then we will use the chat feature and poll questions to get feedback from you. So with that, where are you from? If you could share your city and state in the chat to help us know a little bit more about you guys, that would be great. And then we have two speakers today, Dr. Roger Williams from Ohio State University and Robert Mulligan from Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And then moderators today will be myself, Asmita, Manbir, and Heather. And with that, we're going to go ahead and start with our first speaker, Dr. Roger Williams. He earned his master's degree from Ohio State University and has a PhD from the University of Maine. He is currently an associate professor of forest ecosystem analysis and management in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources at The Ohio State University. Dr. Williams' research program focuses on forest carbon management for climate change mitigation, silviculture systems, and fire usage to manage forests. Today, Dr. Williams will be discussing how trees can be used to enhance soil health in silvopasture systems. With that, I will go ahead and quit sharing my screen so that you can go ahead and.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. From frosty Columbus, Ohio. I don't know where everybody is, but if it's cold where you are, I feel for you. If it's warm, I'm jealous. But I want to just briefly, just go over a few things as it relates to silvopastoral systems, and some of the things that are going to be necessary to establish that, manage it, and some of the benefits of it. Okay. So when we talk about silvopasture, really what it is, it's the integration of trees and grazing livestock together on the same land. And obviously, there's a lot of benefits from that. Particularly, not only are you raising the livestock that you are, wanting to and intending to raise and so forth, but you also have other kinds of products that you can get from the land, whether it's timber, whether it's fruits, different kinds of things being able to get from the same land. So, you can develop some diversified income streams, looking at not only your livestock sales and so forth, but even timber, fruits, nuts, etc. One of the things that we have discovered with the use of silvopastoral systems that it actually improves livestock performance. And a lot of that is because a lot of the livestock, as a result of the shaded conditions and so forth, they are under less stress. The trees also help to reduce the soil erosion. It improves recycling of nutrients and increases carbon sequestration. You get optimal land use. You're trying to maximize the use of your land. It's not just for one particular commodity, but you actually can diversify that. And and it can, depending on the system, it can reduce the need for external inputs like fertilizers, artificial shade structures if that's part of your current management and trying to reduce the stress on your livestock. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. A silvopastoral system. One is actually establishing trees into existing pastures. And obviously, some of the critical things there is you got to make sure that you choose the right tree species with the soils that you are working with. That's very important. Um, and if obviously you're going to be planting relatively young trees, um, so it will initially allow a lot of light to come in for forage production and so forth. But as the trees become older, it's going to take a while before you really get that enhancement of your livestock, improvement of your livestock performance. But as the trees get older and so forth, you start developing more shade, more wind protection, and that's when you start getting noticeable increases in your livestock performance. If you are thinking about doing something like this for the purpose of adding timber as an income stream to your land, you need to make sure that you choose uh, species that are marketable, have good market value, certainly are fast growing and high quality to maximize your income on that. The forage chosen certainly should be palatable and site specific, and importantly, in thinking in the long term, right, that it is tolerant to the shading effects that trees are going to be producing on the land. And some native grasses certainly are going to be a good choice. Um, Big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, Timothy grass, so forth. But obviously, what forages that you are producing, you are creating, is going to be determined, where you are located. Um, Another approach, would be actually converting existing woodlots that you have on your properties, right? Um, so one of the things that you have to be cautious about there is sometimes woodlots are woodlots because that's what the soil is best suited for producing. Sometimes some of those soils, while they are suitable for trees and so forth, they may be less suitable for from an agricultural standpoint. So that certainly is one thing that you have to be cognitive of. And certainly trees are probably going to have to be removed from the woodlot, obviously, to provide foraging space and to provide sunlight for forage growth. Um, and so the question in that respect becomes, what trees should I remove? What trees should I leave behind? What spacing should there be in those residual trees that I leave behind? And certainly, sort of in the same vein, in talking about what you might plant in an existing pasture, certainly you should be looking at trees that are good marketable species, have good form, good quality. Obviously, that's because that's going to provide you the greatest income potential. Um, and the spacing that you leave behind is going to be basically determined by the tree species that you are leaving behind. Obviously, the trees have different kinds of requirements for sunlight, shading, and so forth. Um, Trees that are shade tolerant, the canopies are going to be more dense than those trees that are shade intolerant. Shade intolerant trees, if you leave those behind in your woodlot, those are going to allow more sunlight to come down onto the pasture floor than if the trees were shade tolerant. Okay. Now, obviously, in converting existing woodlots, there's going to be some logging slash that's going to be left behind, and certainly you're going to have to dispose of that. Uh, and you can certainly work into the, what happens to that logging slash, how it's disposed of. That can be worked into a logging contract. Um, it can also be piled and burned as an option. The other thing is that and you can do this also specify this in the logging contract, what the stump height specs should be, um, or even having stump removal, removing the stumps out of there, right? Because obviously, you really don't want to leave much in the way of stumps because that can be a problem for the livestock that you are bringing into the woodlot. Prescribed burning is a good method to eliminate forest litter. The other benefits with that is that the prescribed burning um, also helps better recycle a lot of the nutrients that are tied up in that forest litter, and it thereby also creates a very good nutrient-rich seed bed for seeding in new foraging plants. Now, one caution with hardwoods, if you convert existing woodlots, one thing that hardwoods, this is a problem more with hardwoods than it is with coniferous species, pines, spruces, firs, etc., is that you can start getting development of epicormic branching on the sides of the tree, on the trunk of the tree, when sunlight is exposed to the on the tree trunk. Um, there are dormant buds that are sitting underneath the bark that sunlight will stimulate that, and you will get these branches developing along the side of the tree. Now, the problem there is that obviously branches create knots in wood. And the more knots you have in the wood, the lower the quality of that wood. So the best thing, if that does happen, is basically you have to go out and you have to prune those branches off if they develop. They won't always develop, but that certainly is a potential problem. So the other thing in looking at converting existing woodlots is, what's the spacing going to be? What will be the spacing of your residual trees? You can and it's really going to be determined by a lot of things like the kind of foraging, the material, the grasses and so forth that you are uh, planting out there, what you are growing out there. It's going to be dependent upon the type of species, et cetera, because, if it's a shallow rooted species, you don't want to really leave those out there in the open by themselves because they're going to be very subject to wind throw. So you can do uniform tree spacing, you can do little patches of trees and so forth, just or irregular spacing. So there's going to be a lot of things that are going to determine that. It may just simply be the preferred tree species that you want to leave behind. Where are they, right? I mean, their positions are pretty much fixed where they are out there. So that may be certainly a determinant on that. So just a few comments here. In thinking about your trees, particularly if you are going to plant trees out there, you're going to have to protect your young trees and protect those until the tree crown gets above browsing height. Um, Depending on the type of livestock, foliage and so forth can be very palatable browsing material, and certainly would be a detriment to the growth of your trees. So you can put there's tree protectors around those trees to prevent them from getting browsed upon. Um, Pruning older trees might be necessary to prevent browsing of the lower branches and reduce the attraction of trees to livestock, right? So you just want to try to reduce the amount of browsing material that the trees can can provide, because you want to protect those trees. Because again, for a variety of reasons, those trees can be a very important aspect of your system from a commercial standpoint. And the other thing is, this is going to help reduce damage to your trees. It's going to increase the value of your trees by reducing the amount of knots that you get in the wood. Okay. And certainly it's very critical to monitor damage to trees by livestock, because, and it's not only the quality that can be reduced in the trees as a result of damage by livestock, but it can also provide gateways for pathogens to get inside there to create problems, which can obviously eventually kill your trees. So you have to look at, what kind of damage and try to eliminate the damage that you might get on trees out there. Now, certainly, soil is going to be one of the critical components of the system, right? It's going to, play a major role in your forage production and your growth of your trees. And as I mentioned at the outset here, if you're planting trees, you've got to make sure that you match the right tree species with the particular soil. Um, Not all tree species like all soils, and some tree species can be very particular. So you have to pay attention to that, because obviously you want good performance out of the seedlings that you plant. And your soil should have regular testing to determine if and when any additional fertilizer or lime is needed to support the desirable forage production out there. And that certainly is also important for tree production. Areas of high livestock concentration is going to be need monitoring for soil compaction, okay? Because again, depending on tree species, compacted soil can create problems for roots even of trees. If they are very highly compacted, that actually can produce impediments to root growth and expansion. And therefore, you might need to control grazing to reduce the soil compaction in particular areas by use of paddocks, or strategically placing salt or mineral licks and so forth to sort of keep the livestock away. And certainly, to minimize your issues with compaction, you want to try to encourage more uniform livestock distribution. So anything that you can do to try to create that situation, that's what you want to try to do. So in general, in thinking about all this, soils that form under hardwood trees are very fertile and productive agricultural lands because of the decomposition of the leaves of the soil surface and so forth. One of the things that we do know is that soils formed under pine trees typically are going to be more acidic and sandier, and in general are going to be less suited to growing crops. But now that's not always the case. That's sort of a generality, but that is one of the things that we have noticed. And when you're thinking about planting trees, right, the primary factors that limit tree planting success, certainly the soil drainage. Excessively drained or poorly drained soils can actually serve as impediment to root growth and expansion. Roots don't do well in very wet soils, and you have to look at, trying to, particularly your smaller trees, if you plant them, think about what kind of competition is out there: grasses, weeds, invasive plants, and so forth. Some trees don't like, actually, believe it or not, don't like direct exposure to sun and prefer shaded conditions. And that can create very dry conditions for their survival. And then certainly, particularly with smaller trees, they tend to be a lot of good browse material for a variety of small animals, mammals, and so forth will chew on those, and that can be a problem. So to wrap this up here, in conclusion, when we think about all this, one of the benefits, certainly, and there are many, but one of the benefits is that the system provides shade and protection from wind and can increase livestock production and performance. This has been documented, and it can reduce economic risk by providing multiple products from the land that you are managing. It can create a more attractive landscape. You're going to have higher biodiversity in this land than what you might expect under a normal pasturing system. And it does produce a better image of land stewardship. And depending on the tree species used in the system, you can produce a variety of products from saw timber to firewood, from nuts or fruit to greenery, can be extracted from a silvopastoral system. And certainly, especially since we're talking about trees and so forth, it has the potential to offset carbon emissions from your farm operations because of the carbon that is sequestered and stored in the trees. Some of those carbon emissions from your operations, some of that could be offset by the carbon that you're sequestering in the trees. Silvopastoral systems sequester carbon both in soil and the woody biomass, and studies have shown that carbon sequestration rates are among the highest of any kind of farming system in silvopastoral systems. And the lifetime accumulation of carbon in both soils and biomass is higher than for managing grazing alone. Systems. Certainly, there's a lot more detail that can be brought forward in talking about setting up these systems. But in the time that I have, I hope I've provided you at least sort of an overview of what is involved in creating these systems and what some of the benefits might be.
All right, thank you, Dr. Williams. There is a question out there looking in the Q&A, and it's really related to, are there recommendations or resources, some sort of fact sheet perhaps for matching soil type to the best trees?
Yeah, actually, yes, there are the USDA has produced some publications. I produced a publication, and now it's been about 5 years ago, in looking at the types of tree species. And for those who are interested, I can provide that publication if you give me email address or some way to get that information to you. Talking about tree species selection, planting spacing, and some of the details of that.
Good. Well, yeah, that would be fantastic. We can, if that link is out there, we can certainly share that with participants. I know Scott's just looking. He's posted his contact information in the chat for that, but looking at a lot of questions around what good trees to plant, right? Matching that to soil type. So very good. Looks like we might have one other popped into the Q&A. It says here, don't trees have issues when trees around them are removed? Example, wind. That's a question that just popped in.
Well, yes, and that's why I say, you have to be careful when, if you look at the species that you are going to be leaving behind in terms of converting an existing woodlot. Because yes, shallow-rooted species, it's recommended that you don't leave those out there singly in an open field because they have grown up. First of all, they have grown with all of its neighbors and so forth, and has maintained its integrity and being able to withstand wind conditions. But a shallow-rooted species, you're very likely, if you leave those out in the open, they're going to be very subject to be blown over by the wind. So some species like oak, hickory are very deep rooted, and it'll be okay to leave those out there by themselves. But the shallow rooted ones, you've got to leave them together in groups. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned earlier, is the problems with epicormic branching when trees have been grown in shaded conditions, at least on the bole of the tree, for long periods of time, and then all of a sudden you expose them to sunlight. You have to be wary of that.
And Dr. Lawrence has a question here, asking if there have been cost comparisons between introducing trees versus converting a woodland.
That one, I'm sure there has been. I am not familiar with those cost comparisons, but I'm sure there have been. I'm sorry, I can't answer that directly. I don't have knowledge on that, but certainly that is a consideration, right? But of course, if you are going to be converting an existing woodlot, I would imagine that one of the things you would be paying attention to, obviously, is what you are, not just what you are leaving behind, but what you are taking out, and that hopefully the trees that you take out have some commercial value, and that you'd be able to recoup some of your conversion expenses by the receipts that you get from your timber sale.
All right, and it looks like we have one more here that says inquiring about the impact of livestock manure on soil pH. For in the example that's given is oaks like lower pH. So are there changes that we see by having livestock on that land, right, in terms of manure or nutrient management?
Well, yeah, that's why I mentioned earlier is that it would require some soil testing periodically to monitor um, the changes in your soil chemistry, your pH, and so forth. And I would imagine, yeah, that's going to be important, right? If your soil's it overall a higher pH is not going to be very detrimental to your hardwoods, but as you start getting into more acidity, that becomes more of a problem for hardwood trees, but actually a coniferous tree species, they can tolerate the more acidic soils.
Okay, I think we're through all those questions. I'll throw it back to Kendra here.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, so I will go ahead and introduce our next speaker then, Robert Mulligan. He's earned his bachelor's degree in agricultural education from The Ohio State University and has a master's degree in financial planning from Kansas State University. With over 33 years of experience in natural resources and soil conservation, he currently serves as the Forest Hydrology Manager for the ODNR Division of Forestry. In this role, Bob oversees the Forestry Pollution Abatement Program, enforces Ohio's forestry pollution laws, responds to erosion complaints, and educates loggers and landowners on best management practices to protect water quality. And with that, go ahead and share your screen and go ahead and get started whenever you feel like it.
Helps if I unmute myself there. Hopefully you can see my screen okay.
Yes.
Before I start in my presentation, I'll just do a quick follow-up on one of the questions that just came through that I might be able to chime in on. Someone was asking about which trees might be suitable to plant, things like that, based on your soil type. And one of the resources we have out there that we just do not utilize nearly enough is the Web Soil Survey that USDA publishes or has available online. We also have paper copies of soil surveys for every square foot in the United States has a soil survey. So there's actually a list of trees that are adapted to each soil type, and also a list of trees that you're likely to find growing naturally on those sites. So it's a good way to figure out, get you in the ballpark of what trees might be adapted to your site. So I'd highly recommend that. So Dr. Williams did a great job of laying out the basics of silvopasture. And I'm going to also focus heavily on silvopasture today as well. As Kendra mentioned, my background, I feel like I've lived about 3 different lives professionally, but most of my work has been in the world of soil conservation. in one aspect or another, either in agriculture or in forestry. So anytime I get a chance to talk about both in the same day, it's a good day for me. So when you think about silvopasture, most of us think about if you ask the average person, what's it like to put cattle or any kind of livestock in the woods? This picture that I've got on the screen kind of comes to mind for a lot of people. It's basically the cows are hanging out there trying to work for a living out there, basically half starved, trying to figure out what they're going to eat. This is not the world we're really looking for. We're looking for a managed system here where we're taking advantage of the trees and actually being able to grow grass in the same system. Oops. For some reason, my slide did not advance. Yep, there it goes. So when you look at the literature, you go online and just start doing some searching and things for silvopasture, the image you'll see more often than anything else is the picture on the left. And this is more of a southern type picture where you're coming up a pine plantation, actually thinning the rows back out of it to expose more sunlight. These systems are, I won't say they're perfected, but these systems have been around for decades now. And they've got a pretty good handle on how these systems work and how to make them work. I'm in Southeast Ohio. I don't have a lot of pine plantations where I'm at. I'm dealing with eastern hardwoods. Each site's a little different. The aspect is different. We don't have flat ground here where I'm at. So it's more of a science project for us to try to figure out how to get the trees out and make grass grow. And as Dr. Williams mentioned earlier, you have to make some intelligent decisions on which trees you're going to take out, which ones you're going to leave behind. So there's a lot of work involved into it. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately about sunlight manipulation. We have to get sunlight to the forest floor to make this stuff happen. And if I'm starting with a eastern hardwood forest that has an understory in it, anywhere from, ankle high to, maybe 40, 50 feet high, I got to figure out which trees I'm going to take out, how I'm going to keep those trees under control, and also how I'm going to get trees to regenerate in that system as well if I want it to be sustainable. So these are all challenges we have to overcome. So I'm going to build this presentation off of this slide right here, basically asking a question. And it is, can my hardwood forest that I'm using for agroforestry or silviculture, silvopasture, be sustainable long term? And that's the challenge. Can we make this system last, more than our lifetime or more than just a few years? Can we sustain this thing? And one of the questions we have to deal with is soil erosion. Can I keep my soil erosion under control? Can I protect the soil health, not have compaction like Dr. Williams mentioned earlier? Can I keep the water quality coming off my property under control? And then the second aspect I'm going to focus on is, can I maintain enough tree basal area out there, enough shade long term and get enough natural regeneration? Or am I going to have to step in and do something on my own to make that happen? So when I'm talking to landowners, I do see this quite often anymore, where I see landowners that are taking out trees, maybe as part of a logging job, but then they decide they want to go back and make a pasture field out of these areas. Before you do anything like that, I'm going to recommend that people get a hold of a professional forester and do an assessment of what you're actually dealing with. What's the value of that timber as it stands right now? The saddest thing I ever see is when people end up cutting down trees for whatever reason. It could be just the finances, or maybe to convert to silvopasture or whatever. But they're taking trees that are right in the sweet spot of their growing. And if you've got white oaks out there, some things of high value, and you're cutting them down in their prime, you may be costing yourself a lot of money. An attempt to make more money, you're maybe costing yourself money doing that. So make sure you know what you're cutting down before you do that. So some good candidates, if you're just experimenting with silvopasture or want to get into it, you might look for like low value stands that are on your property that maybe have some early succession species out there growing. In other words, you're a long ways away at this point from having a very high value sale, the timber. So that might be a good place to experiment, learn how these systems work before you make a mistake. If you have wind damage stands, that might be another option to salvage some of that and make pasture out of that. Diseased, or certainly if you have softwood stands that are low value, that's another prime opportunity. And the other thing I will caution you to be careful with cherry trees. In the area of the state where I'm at, we have a lot of cherry trees that come in when land reverts back to woods. One of the first trees we see pop up here is cherry. Cherry, when it does wilt, when you cut that tree down or if it falls over, that wilted cherry leaves can kill cattle in a heartbeat. So be careful with that. If you're interested in going to hog production in the woods, which a lot of people are starting to do that now, it's a very interesting kind of an aspect of all this. You're going to obviously have some mass producing species out there. And as Dr. Williams talked about, soil and drainage is really key. Just keep in mind that a lot of the woods we have here in the state, they exist because our forefathers couldn't figure out how to farm it, or maybe they failed at farming in the past. So you might be fighting some soil conditions there that you may not be aware of as of yet. And the other part of it is watch out for invasive species. We know they're out there in the woods. Anytime you begin to thin that stand, those invasives are going to rear their ugly heads. So make sure you have a game plan for that. Either get those under control before you make the thinning harvest, or maybe add some goats or other animals to the mix to control that. So I work for the Division of Forestry, and obviously anything related to putting animals in the woods is probably controversial to most people in the forestry world or the conservation world. And there's some good valid reasons for that. As it says here, soil erosion, compaction, and degradation are all potential risks. Those are actual real things we have to deal with. So I got this picture from online from the Missouri Department of Conservation, and you can go to any website from any conservation agency in the nation. You're going to find similar pictures to this. As foresters, a lot of times we start to see things like this, and we realize that, hey, we see what happens when wild hogs get in the woods, or we've all seen where people have fed round bales in the woods and made a mess of it. That's the image that the public has, and a lot of us as conservationists have, and it doesn't have to be this way. In Ohio, I know some people from other states, but here in Ohio, we also have a CAUV program, current agricultural use valuation tax program. We have a forest tax law program, and of course, EQIP is available nationwide. But foresters are also used to dealing with that. And those programs also either discourage or don't allow livestock in the woods typically. So that's the background or the history we're dealing with. So if you look at the literature and all the research that's out there, especially some of the older literature and research, almost everything points away from introducing cattle or any kind of livestock in the woods. But in 1986, I found this study I thought was interesting. It came out of West Virginia, Parsons, West Virginia. U.S. Forest Service did some some peer review. They went back and looked through some of the literature and some of the research projects from the past that all discouraged livestock in the woods. And they kind of came to the conclusion that a lot of the literature out there kind of over-exaggerated the dangers of it and the permanent damage it can cause. And these are my words, not theirs, but it kind of said that some of the concerns are overstated. And I thought that was interesting to think about. So I thought I'll go online and just see what I can find out there that's floating around the internet as far as what's the messaging that producers are getting from extension, from departments of conservation, and the other professionals around the country. What's the messaging that we're giving them? And the messaging is keep your animals out of the woods. Over and over again, that's what we're telling people. And I picked up this little picture. This was out there on the internet from the Missouri Department of Conservation. I've seen this picture many other times in various forums, and you probably have too. On the right-hand side, it says a grazed woodland. It shows original soil, shows compacted roots. The soil's missing, or there's compaction on top of the roots. It says fungus and disease enter through root wounds. Factually accurate, 100% factually accurate. So on the left side, it says an ungrazed woods, and then it says soil. You can see the natural soil line there. You got the fibrous roots toward the surface, which is exactly what we want to maintain. But it says soil erosion in a grazed forest can be 100 times greater than the erosion in an ungrazed forest. That is factually accurate. You can find research out there. There's tons of studies out there that'll show that number. Now, if you're a farmer and you read this or you see this, and it says your erosion can go up 100 times what it was with the woods, who in their right mind would stick animals in the woods, right? I mean, that's the first inclination most of us are going to have. And that's the strong messaging of that. But like I put at the bottom, let's add some context to what those numbers actually mean. And then maybe a little surprise to some people. This is actually, this, don't get hung up too much on the date. This is from 1945. I know some people that are in the conservation world will point out that, the universal soil loss equation has changed multiple times since 1945. Don't get hung up too much on the actual numbers because these are very site specific. What I want you to see is the general principle of what's going on here. So they did a research project and looked at this soil type. And if you look there at the bottom, it says cultivated soil. If you have a cultivated soil in that particular soil type in 1945, they estimated that 20.6% of all the rainfall that hit that soil ended up washing off and not going into the ground. It's overland flow. And as a result of that, they were getting over 17 tons per acre of erosion, which most of you know that's not sustainable for any length of time. They found on the same soil type, if they added pasture to it, or they added grass to the situation, had grass cover, they could increase that or decrease the overland flow down to 13.8%. And at that point, the soil loss is only a tenth of a ton per acre, very sustainable. And if you go to woods on the same soil, the overland flow almost disappears, drops clear down to 3.2%. In other words, 97% of all the rainfall on that property is going down in the ground, not running off. And the soil loss dropped to 0.01 tons per acre. That's geological rate of erosion. There's no man-made effect at all to that point. But the key is it's on undisturbed woods. So again, to add some context to this, we just saw in that the Missouri conservation statement there said grazing in a hardwood forest can increase erosion rates up to 100 times. Let's assume we have the worst case scenario and we actually get 100 times more erosion from that woodland than we had before by adding livestock to it. If you do the math on that, remember with the woodland soil, we were only getting 0.01 tons of soil loss, negligible. And you multiply that times 100, you end up getting 1 ton per acre of soil loss. And 2,000 pounds of soil moving on the landscape sounds like a lot, but you also have to consider that we have what's called a tolerable soil loss. And basically what USDA determines the tolerable soil loss, or T, you often hear it in conservation plans, is how much soil can we have eroding at any given time and perpetually. It could happen year after year after year and not lose yield. So if it's a cornfield, if you're making 200, that soil is capable of making 200 bushels per acre, you can lose up to a certain amount of tonnage of soil every year and still maintain production. And most of our soils in Ohio are going to be somewhere in that 2 to 5 range is pretty common. So you begin to see 1 ton per acre, although it sounds like a lot, is very sustainable. We can do that forever and not cause a problem production-wise. So it just adds some context to this. So why is the runoff so low from these wooded soils? Why is erosion rate so low? Roger touched on some of this before, but accumulated organic matter is a big part of it. We got fibrous roots toward the surface, which is a big thing. There's a channel for water to get away. We got soil is free of compaction, assuming there hadn't been any recent logging done to it. Excellent percolation rates, like I mentioned earlier. And the result of that is exceptional water quality, which we don't want to lose that benefit for sure. So our biggest risk, in my opinion, is not switching to pasture. That's a very sustainable way. We can still make that work. The biggest risk that I see is that thinning harvest that you got to make this system work. And if you look at the picture on the right, this is the world I have to deal with every day. This is a very normal picture. Nothing wrong with this picture necessarily. But in order to extract trees, we have to get equipment in there to make that happen. And any place we run that equipment, we're going to have compaction. We're going to have the potential of soil erosion because we have bare soil in those areas. We have the tools and technology to deal with that. That's not an issue. Dr. Williams mentioned also too that removing stumps. I think that probably has the biggest potential for problems for us. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these forest soils that we're dealing with they're in forest because our forefathers had trouble farming them. They may have uh, farm them negligently. At least in my area, we have, some D and E slopes even that historically had corn on them back in pioneer days. You can still find old dead furrows and things out in some of these woods that you can't believe it's there, but it's there. So a lot of these soils are actually pretty fragile once you get below that organic matter layer. And if we start popping stumps and running equipment over top of that, we do run the risk of causing some pretty serious water quality issues and some sustainability issues. So one potential solution to that, if you're able to do it, maybe to incorporate goats into the system, cut the stumps off at a reasonable height, and then go back in and while we're waiting for the stumps to rot out, basically controlling that vegetation with animals rather than relying on a mower. So one thing I just want to make sure I point out, I'd be kind of negligent if I didn't point this out because it's kind of my job, but anytime you're doing any kind of work in the woods, in Ohio at least, we do have a set of rules, a law, Ohio Forestry Pollution Abatement Law, that basically requires you to use best management practices for erosion control. We don't have time to go into this today. I will just point out on the right side there, it shows the book that we use, stands as our reference point and our education tool and also our standard. So anytime we see logging activity, we compare it to the standard in that book. Things like water bars, seeding, mulching, things all fall into line with that. You'll also notice on there that we have a picture of prescribed burning. Prescribed burning is also covered as part of that regulation. So there are standards for how to set up like fire breaks, things like that, maintaining erosion control measures for fire breaks, and also tree planting is also covered. So if you're wanting to convert from crop field to forest land or add some trees to the mix, there are some guidelines for that as well. So to answer my first question, will my hardwood forest used for agroforestry or silvopasture be sustainable long term? I think from a soil aspect, with some caution, I think most farmers can make that work. We have the technology and the tools in our toolbox to make that happen. I think I've demonstrated that even with adding the animals to the mix, we can keep the erosion rates at an acceptable level. So that takes us to our second question. And I'm going to cover this very briefly. I know we're kind of running out of time here, but the picture on the left, this is a thinning harvest that took place. This picture here was about three years after the harvest was taken out or was taken. And you can already see the regrowth that's starting to explode in these areas. Well, if we do the same kind of thing and do a thinning harvest and then put it back into grass, we're not going to get this natural regrowth. The livestock are going to keep nipping the leaves back. And Dr. Williams kind of touched on it earlier. We're probably going to use some kind of a protection there for the saplings that are wanting to come back. We pick out the trees we want. Maybe we use an exclusionary fence to keep the livestock off those temporarily. Tree tubes might be an answer, but that's also going to be a cattle rub to a certain extent. But you're going to have some kind of a strategy to get those trees to come back. You're going to get crowning in some of these trees, so you're going to lose some sunlight over time with the trees wanting to crown, and they have more room to grow. They're going to expand outward. So you may end up having to harvest more trees at some point, but you're also may have to end up planting some more trees at some point. If those livestock are given unrestricted access to every tree growing on the forest floor. So, go to the next slide. So I guess my answer to that one is a question. And I think that, like I say, the first one, the soil erosion, I think that's something most farmers can be taught and can adapt to pretty easily. The second one, I think, is going to take a lot more skill than maybe many of us are capable of doing on our farms without some professional help. And right now, I think the foresters, at least that I deal with, they're not really attuned to this type of management yet. They know the trees very well. They know the nature of the trees, how they grow and whatnot. But regulating that light and keeping that perfect amount of light is going to take a lot of work and a lot of monitoring over time too. That one of the first slides I put up there, I put a 1964 calendar, and my grandpa was still farming our farm in 1964, and I got to thinking, if he would have set up a system like this in 1964, what would it look like now? I think it probably would have went one of two ways. Either the trees would have taken back over, either do the canopy closing back off, or the cattle would have simply grazed all the understory out, the older trees would have fell over, and we'd end up with an open pasture without the management there. So I did put a picture of hogs here. I think this is a system that can be adopted pretty readily and easily. Um, with modern electric fence, hogs are very easy to maintain in the woods, easy to move, and they can do very minimal damage if you keep them moving and let them eat the acorns and then move on to the next spot, keep it moving. And you don't really have to manipulate the light to make that work either. That's a system we can add really easily to our woods potentially. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and wrap up right there and see if there's any questions.
Right. Thank you, Robert. Very good. Yes, Dr. Lawrence has a question here. Low impact logging. He referenced seeing logging with horses on steeper slopes in the Black Forest in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a big fan of horse logging. I actually graze draft horses myself, so I'm kind of a little bit biased that way. But the thing I'll caution people about with horse logging in general is at some point you still have to get the logs out of the woods. And typically, what the benefit of the horses, in my opinion, is from the stump back to your trail, because they do have very little. The compaction is not a continuous tire track, and they tend to any compaction you do get tends to break up very easily with freezing and thawing. The problem with horses probably is that once you get back to the forest trail, you still have to drag them back to the truck. Even with the logging arch, you're still going to get some erosion. The horses will compact the trail just like a skidder will. So you're still going to use some best management practices for the main trail. But yeah, from the stump back to that trail, there's tremendous benefits for horses for sure.
Okay. Any other questions looming out there? So please feel free, whether they be for Robert or for Dr. Williams. Burning questions. Oh, here we go. It seems that a lot of woodlots are mixed with water, streams, creeks. Are fences required to keep livestock from getting manure into those areas?
Well, I can start with that one, I guess. It all depends. It's going to depend, honestly. If that's your only source of water for those livestock, you're probably going to want to have some way to control that or move the watering spot from time to time, so you don't end up with issues with that. Um, Most cattle, when they're looking for water in the summertime, it's not because they're looking for water. They're looking to get away from flies or looking to get away from the heat. Well, we solved part of the problem by allowing them access to the woods. If they're not stressed out with heat all the time, they're less likely to get a water, is my opinion on some of that. Every site's going to be a little different. I wouldn't automatically assume that you have to exclude them from the stream. I've seen examples. It depends on how much cattle pressure you have in there too, how many animals are in there per acre, or how much access they have to the water. It's going to be something you have to look on a case by case basis, I think.
And then just as a follow-up to that was the offset of the fencing. So how far does that fencing, if you are going to need to fence them, how far does that need to be from the water? Yeah.
There's a couple strategies out there on that. One is historically we've always fenced out, the farmer, and it's always fences out as close to the stream as we can to make use of our pastures in an open pasture situation. Another strategy that's kind of evolved over time is pulling that fence back away from the stream a little bit and then actually going back in the stream and flash grazing the banks. And that's a system I've seen really work really well in open pastures. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work in a silvopasture situation as well, where you're basically, you want to graze the banks. A lot of farmers do anyway to control the vegetation and the weeds. But you don't want them in there for days and days on end. You want to go that more like a day or so at a time just to flash graze it. That's one strategy.
Someone also asked if, and livestock excrement, urine impact water quality.
It definitely can. It's more of an issue, I think, of having the animals in the stream or close to the stream. That research study that I cited earlier from 1986, that's actually one of the things they actually addressed in that study. And I had a quote here somewhere from the, if I still have it or not. I think the quote they had was something about basically the ill effects of the manure were slight. So in other words, if you've got manure being deposited in the woods and you've got a good pathway for the water to go down in the ground and not do a lot of surface flow, you're going to solve a lot of those nutrient problems and pathogen problems by getting the manure and all the urine and whatnot in the ground as opposed to it washing off. The bigger problem is when you have them close to the stream and they're standing in the stream or close to the stream in close proximity, it's going to migrate itself into the water for sure.
The one thing I would add is, if the water in the woods pretty much is confined to the woods, that becomes less of a problem. I don't know if I'd say problem, but something to consider because when you're dealing with streams, if you got water flowing through, but it doesn't stay on your property, right? You always have to be concerned about the impacts of what you are doing in the water on your land as the water flows down further downstream, right? That's always a concern. So and as Robert was saying, it's a case by case situation. It's really dependent upon what kind of water that you are talking about on there, because certainly we in being a good land steward, right? You always want to make sure that what you are doing on your property does not affect others. It's those externalities that we talk about in economics, but it also applies to things like this.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would state is that I don't think by grazing the woodland you're going to have any increase to pathogens or nutrients getting to the stream. I think it's going to be at least on par with what your neighbor is who has an open pasture. That's kind of how I would look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there's a comment too in the Q&A that talks about, causing blooms in Lake Erie. And just quickly, I think as we're kind of wrapping to the end here, you guys can address that. But my guess would be is it really depends on your watershed. Not all of Ohio flows into all the same parts of Lake Erie, right? So we have watershed. So knowing your watershed, right, is important. Other comments that you might have, it's going to be, it depends, I guess, would be a response to that question. But yeah, causing algal blooms in Lake Erie would depend on your location and your watershed, which way your water
Yeah.
moves.
Well, like I say, I think those risks, we're kind of making the assumption, or at least I'm making the assumption that the person doing this, that would be adopting the system, is probably actually doing some grazing already in open pastures anyway, or was planning on either converting their woodland to a pasture or, leaving it as a woods. That's the options they have. I really don't think if you end up clearing that off and had an open pasture, you'd have any less. We already demonstrated you're not going to have any less erosion. And I think you're probably actually going to have more nutrient loading potentially from the open pasture than you are the wooded pasture. If you can maintain the integrity of that soil structure that's developed and we can maintain those fibrous roots in the system, we're definitely going to have less overland flow. And that should lead to higher water quality. I get there's a lot of variables here and it's a lot of management to make it work, but there's not a lot of downside if you can make it work properly.
Right. And I would just add to what Robert was saying, with streams and so forth, if you are removing trees from an existing woodlot, you're converting that, probably what you would want to do would be to leave the tree density higher along the streams for the purpose of, creating the filtering effect, in essence, in creating a buffer along the
Yes.
streams, and that would be probably the best approach to that.
And the other aspect of that too is when you're doing that thinning harvest, we keep talking about, we're reducing the number of trees that are out there. Anytime you're doing that near the stream, you definitely want to keep your equipment back away from the stream and just basically winch the material away from the stream. Don't run heavy equipment along the edge of the stream or close to it where it's going to compact it, or do anything to make that buffer area that he's talking about less effective.
All right. Well, I think at this time, Kendra, I'll turn the wrap up for that over to you. Thank you all for testing our speaker's ability to answer questions.